On a scorching July afternoon in 1847, in rural Chesterfield County, Virginia, a tobacco plantation owner entered his weathered barn and discovered something that would force his entire community to confront the darkest contradictions of their society. What Abraham Sutherland found that day, his own 23-year-old son living in secret with 3 enslaved women and their children, would trigger one of the most controversial public ceremonies ever recorded in the annals of antebellum Virginia. The county clerk would document the event with trembling hands, noting that what transpired in the town square defied all custom and law, yet was witnessed by no fewer than 400 souls. For generations, the descendants of those who stood in that square have refused to speak of what they saw. And the official marriage certificates, plural, remain sealed in a private family vault. Their contents are known only to a handful of historians who have sworn never to reveal the full, detailed truth. What you are about to hear is the true story of how one man's desperate attempt to control his legacy created a scandal that nearly tore a county apart. A story pieced together from private letters, plantation records, and sworn testimonies that were deliberately excluded from the public archives. Before we delve deeper into the story of the Sutherland plantation and what truly happened inside that barn, if you are fascinated by the hidden and disturbing chapters of American history, the ones they never teach in schools, make sure to subscribe to Liturgy of Fear. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into the darkest corners of the past. And tell us in the comments, where are you listening from? What hidden stories from your own state or city should we uncover next? Now, let's return to that sweltering Virginia afternoon in 1847, when everything Abraham Sutherland believed about his family was on the verge of collapse. The truth is, the situation Abraham uncovered that day had been building for years, hidden in plain sight on the very land he believed he controlled absolutely. In 1847, Chesterfield County was at the heart of Virginia's tobacco empire, a patchwork of plantations stretching along the Appomattox River, where the soil still yielded gold in the form of bright-leaf tobacco. The Sutherland estate, known locally as Hollow Crest, sprawled across 800 acres of prime bottomland, worked by 42 enslaved people whose labor had built the family's fortune over 3 generations. The main house was a Federal-style manor with 4 white columns, standing on a gentle rise that overlooked fields stretching endlessly toward the tree line. Behind it, a cluster of outbuildings formed a small village of their own, the kitchen house, smokehouse, dairy, and at the compound's farthest edge, a massive tobacco barn, its walls weathered to the color of old pewter. That summer, Abraham Sutherland was 58 years old, a man whose rigid posture and precisely trimmed grey beard reflected his view of the world as something that could, and should, be ordered according to strict principles. He had inherited Hollow Crest from his father and expanded it methodically, purchasing adjacent properties and additional slaves with the calculated precision of a chess player. His wife, Catherine, had died 6 years earlier from consumption, leaving him with their only child, a son named Thomas, who had always seemed too gentle for this world. Abraham was preparing him for the inheritance. Thomas Sutherland had turned 23 that spring, tall and lean, with his mother's dark eyes and a quiet manner his father often mistook for weakness. He had been educated at a private academy in Richmond, studying agriculture and business just as Abraham intended, but he had returned to Hollow Crest 2 years earlier with what his father called impractical notions about modernizing their operations. They argued frequently about crop rotation, about purchasing new equipment, about the efficiency of their labor management. Abraham saw these disagreements as mere growing pains, believing his son would eventually understand that the old ways worked because they were right. What Abraham did not know was that Thomas had stopped sleeping in the main house 18 months earlier. The arrangement had begun innocently enough. Thomas had convinced his father that he needed to supervise the tobacco curing more closely, that the delicate process of transforming green leaves into a marketable product required constant attention during the critical weeks of late summer. He had moved a cot into the small office attached to the curing barn, insisting he needed to monitor temperature and humidity through the night. Abraham had approved this show of dedication, even bragging to neighboring planters that his son was finally showing proper commitment to the family business. But Thomas hadn't been monitoring tobacco. In the main section of that barn, behind stacks of wooden hogsheads and hanging bundles of leaf, he had created something that would have been incomprehensible to his father, a home. He had partitioned off a section with salvaged lumber, installed a small stove for cooking and heat, and brought in proper furniture, piece by piece, under cover of darkness. And he had been living there with 3 women who officially belonged to his father: Sarah, 25 years old, who had worked in the main house as a seamstress; Rebecca, 22, assigned to the dairy; and Mary, just 20, who had been trained as a cook. By the summer of 1847, Sarah had given birth to a 2-year-old boy, Rebecca was nursing an infant daughter, and Mary was 6 months pregnant. The women hadn't been stolen away or hidden by force. Each had come to that barn willingly, drawn by Thomas's quiet promises of something different, something better. He had taught them to read using his mother's old books. He had convinced the plantation's overseer, a man named Dutch Ricks, who owed Thomas a significant gambling debt, to alter the work schedules so the women could spend nights away from the slave quarters without raising immediate suspicion. Thomas had even been setting aside money, keeping detailed records in a leather journal of every dollar he saved, planning for some distant future when he might buy their freedom and escape Virginia entirely. It was a fantasy, of course, built on the unstable foundation of youth and desperation. And like all such fantasies in the antebellum South, it was destined to collapse. The discovery happened on July 14, a Wednesday afternoon when the temperature had climbed past 95 degrees and the air hung thick enough to cut. Abraham had been inspecting the tobacco fields, walking the rows with his overseer to assess the crop's readiness for harvest. They had been discussing labor allocation for the coming weeks when Abraham noticed something odd. Dutch Rick seemed nervous, kept steering the conversation away from questions about night supervision of the curing process. Abraham had built his fortune on noticing small discrepancies that revealed larger problems. He dismissed Ricks and walked alone toward the curing barn, his boots raising small clouds of dust from the parched earth. The barn's main doors stood partially open to catch any hint of a breeze. Abraham had been expecting to find Thomas reviewing the previous year's curing records, preparing for the imminent harvest. Instead, he heard children laughing. The sound stopped him completely. There should not be children anywhere near the curing barn, it was strictly off-limits to everyone except Thomas and the senior workers. Abraham moved quietly toward the sound, which seemed to be coming from deeper within the barn's shadowy interior. As his eyes adjusted to the dimness, he saw the makeshift partition wall, saw the gap where Thomas had hung a curtain made from old flour sacks. What Abraham witnessed when he pulled that curtain aside would be described in his private letters with language that veered between rage and something approaching horror. Thomas sat at a rough wooden table with Sarah, Rebecca, and Mary, all of them eating from actual plates, not the tin dishes allocated to enslaved people, but ceramic plates from the main house. The 2-year-old boy was playing on the floor with carved wooden toys. The infant nursed at Rebecca's breast. On the wall, someone had hung a calendar where dates were marked with careful excess, as though this hidden family was tracking time like any normal household. Abraham's first word, according to Thomas's later testimony, was not an angry shout, but a whispered question: "How long?" Thomas stood slowly, placing himself between his father and the women. 18 months, he said. And I won't apologize for it. What followed wasn't the violent confrontation one might expect. Abraham Sutherland didn't strike his son or immediately summon the overseer. Instead, he did something Thomas later described as far more terrifying. He went completely still, his face draining of color as he looked from his son to the women to the children and back again. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the flat effect of someone calculating the scope of a disaster. "You've been breeding them," Abraham said, "like this was your property to manage." Thomas tried to explain about his feelings for the women, about his plans to eventually free them, about how the situation was more complex than his father could understand. But Abraham wasn't listening. His mind was already working through the implications, seeing not a human drama, but a tangle of legal and social problems that threatened to destroy everything he had built. The enslaved women belonged to him, not Thomas. Any children born to them were his property as well, assets on his plantation's ledger. But Thomas had been acting as their husband, a relationship that had no legal standing, but would be recognized by everyone in the county as a moral fact. If word of this spread, Abraham would become a laughingstock, the old fool who couldn't control his own son or his own property. Worse, there would be questions about what other irregularities existed at Hollow Crest, questions that might attract unwanted attention from neighbors, from business associates, from the careful social networks that maintained power in antebellum Virginia. "Stay here," Abraham finally said. "All of you. Don't leave this barn. Don't speak to anyone. I need to think." He walked back to the main house in the blazing afternoon heat, his mind racing. In his study, he pulled out the plantation's record books, reviewing the entries for Sarah, Rebecca, and Mary. Each was listed with her age, her skills, her approximate value. Beside Rebecca's name, someone, probably Thomas, had added a small notation in different ink: dairy work, excellent productivity. Abraham stared at those words, recognizing his son's handwriting, realizing that Thomas had been slowly inserting these women into the official records as valuable workers, probably planning to eventually request their purchase or transfer. The audacity of it was almost impressive. Almost. Abraham sat at his desk until well after dark, occasionally making notes on a sheet of paper, crossing out ideas, writing new ones. The house slaves reported later that he didn't call for dinner, didn't light more than a single candle. They heard him talking to himself once, a short burst of words none of them could make out clearly. By morning, Abraham Sutherland had made his decision. It would be a decision that shocked everyone who learned of it, argued about in Chesterfield County for generations. But in Abraham's calculation, it was the only solution that gave him any chance of controlling the scandal, of turning a disaster into something he could survive. He would make his son marry all three women. Publicly. In the town square where everyone could witness it. The announcement came at breakfast the following morning, delivered to Thomas in the main house's dining room with the same tone Abraham used to discuss crop yields or equipment purchases. "You will marry them," Abraham said, setting down his coffee cup with deliberate precision. "All three. The ceremony will be Saturday at noon in the courthouse square. I've already sent word to Reverend Talbot." Thomas stared at his father, certain he had misheard. "That's impossible. Virginia law doesn't recognize." "I'm aware of what Virginia law recognizes," Abraham interrupted. "The marriages won't be legally binding, but they will be public. Every planter in the county will witness my son taking responsibility for his actions, standing before God and community to declare these women as his wives. It's the only way to control what people will say, the only way to establish that this wasn't mere exploitation." The calculation behind Abraham's plan was both brilliant and deeply cynical. By forcing a public ceremony, he would preempt the worst gossip, establishing a narrative of irregular but acknowledged commitment rather than casual abuse. The story would become about his son's strange idealism, his foolish notions about enslaved women. Troubling, yes, but contained within the framework of a young man's errors. More importantly, by making the marriages public but legally void, Abraham maintained actual ownership of the women and children. They would remain his property, assets he could manage, sell, or dispose of as he saw fit. Thomas's protests were immediate and vehement. The ceremony would humiliate the women, would reduce their relationship to a public spectacle. But Abraham had anticipated every objection. "You wanted them acknowledged," he said coldly. "You wanted their children to have standing. This gives them that, or as close as they'll ever get in Virginia. The alternative is I sell all three tomorrow morning to a cotton trader heading for Mississippi, and you never see them or those children again. Your choice." It wasn't a choice at all. And both men knew it. The next 3 days passed in a strange, suspended atmosphere at Hollow Crest. Abraham had Ricks move Thomas and the women into one of the guest rooms in the main house, a tactical decision that kept them under observation while also beginning the process of legitimizing their presence. Sarah, Rebecca, and Mary walked through the house's public spaces in a kind of daze, wearing clothes that had been pulled from storage, sitting at the dining table for meals while other enslaved people served them. The cognitive dissonance was profound and deliberate. They were being treated as family members while remaining chattel, elevated and degraded in the same breath. Abraham spent those days visiting neighboring plantations, personally delivering invitations to the Saturday ceremony. His approach was carefully calibrated. He presented the wedding as an eccentricity, an indulgence of his son's peculiar sensibilities that nevertheless demonstrated Thomas's willingness to take responsibility. "The boy's got notions," Abraham would say, shaking his head with practiced resignation. but at least his standing up before God and community. How many young men can say that these days? The responses varied. Some planters laughed, seeing the whole thing as an elaborate joke at Thomas's expense. Others were more disturbed, sensing implications they couldn't quite articulate. A few refused the invitation outright, considering the entire spectacle beneath their dignity. But Abraham had predicted that most would attend out of sheer curiosity. And he was right. By Friday evening, it was clear the courthouse square would be packed. In town, Reverend Marcus Talbot struggled with his own crisis of conscience. The 52-year-old minister had served Chesterfield County's Episcopal congregation for nearly 2 decades, presiding over countless weddings that reinforced the social order of Plantation, Virginia. What Abraham Sutherland was asking him to do existed in a gray area that made him deeply uncomfortable. The ceremonies wouldn't be legally binding, he'd been assured of that. But they would carry spiritual weight, his participation lending the proceedings a religious legitimacy that felt dangerous. Talbot met with Abraham twice during those 3 days, trying to find some way to refuse without directly challenging a man who contributed substantially to the church's finances. Abraham was prepared for this, too, framing the issue in terms the Reverend couldn't easily dismiss. Weren't these women's souls worth saving? Wasn't it better to bring them into the Christian covenant through marriage, even irregular marriage, than to leave them in sin? And wasn't Thomas showing more moral courage than most young men of his class by publicly acknowledging his responsibilities? The arguments were specious, of course, twisting theology to serve Abraham's pragmatic ends, but they gave Talbot enough cover to agree. He would perform the ceremonies, he decided, because the alternative, leaving these women and children completely outside any social or spiritual recognition, seemed worse. On Friday night, Thomas sat with Sarah, Rebecca, and Mary in the guest room, trying to explain what would happen the next day. They had all agreed to go through with it, not because they believed it would change their status in any meaningful way, but because the alternative Abraham had threatened was unbearable. Still, the reality of standing in the town square, of being displayed before the county's white population, filled them with a dread that went beyond ordinary fear. "We'll leave Virginia after this," Thomas promised, though he had no clear plan for how. "I'll find a way. Maybe Ohio, maybe Pennsylvania. Somewhere you'll be free." Mary, the youngest, touched her swollen belly. "And we'll be married. Really married. Where it matters." Thomas nodded, believing it himself, even though every practical consideration argued against it. The fantasy was all he had left to offer. Saturday morning arrived with the sky like beaten brass, the sun already punishing. By 8 a.m. Abraham rose early, dressing in his finest black suit, checking his appearance in the mirror with the same attention he'd give before a business negotiation. Because that's what this was, really, the negotiation with his community, an attempt to dictate the terms of his family scandal before it could dictate its own terms. At Hollow Crest, the house slaves had been instructed to prepare the women for the ceremony. They helped Sarah, Rebecca, and Mary into dresses that had belonged to Thomas's mother, white cotton gowns that had been hastily altered to fit. The symbolism was heavy-handed but deliberate. Abraham wanted the visual language of traditional weddings, wanted to anchor this irregular spectacle in recognizable forms. The women stood before a mirror together, looking at their reflections, seeing themselves transformed into brides in a mockery that somehow felt more cruel than any direct violence. Thomas wore a dark suit and held himself with a rigid formality that masked his terror. He'd barely slept, had spent the night alternating between anger at his father and fear for the women he'd dragged into this situation. As they prepared to leave for town, he pulled Sarah aside. "If you want to run," he whispered, "I won't blame you. Any of you. I can create a distraction." Sarah cut him off, her voice low and certain. "We're going. We're standing up there with you because maybe this crazy thing your father's doing actually means something. Maybe people will see us and have to think about what we are, who we are. Maybe that's worth more than hiding." It was either profound courage or profound delusion. Thomas couldn't tell which. The wagon ride into town took 40 minutes, Abraham sitting up front with Thomas, the 3 women and 2 children in the back with a house slave named Peter who'd been instructed to keep watch. They passed other plantations, past enslaved people working in fields who stopped to stare at the strange procession. Word had spread, of course it had, and people were already speculating about what would happen in the courthouse square. As they approached the town, Thomas could see the square was already filling with spectators. Courthouse Square sat at the heart of Chesterfield, dominated by a red brick courthouse with a small bell tower. A raised platform stood before the courthouse steps, typically used for auctions and public notices. That's where the ceremony would take place, elevated so everyone could witness it clearly. Abraham had thought of everything. Even the choice of location carried meaning. This wasn't a church wedding, sacred and private, but a civic event, public and enforceable by community judgment, if not by law. The wagon rolled to a stop at the square's edge. Abraham climbed down first, then turned to help the women descend, playing the role of solicitor's father-in-law with practiced ease. Thomas followed, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly as he took Sarah's arm, then Rebecca's, then Mary's. They stood together at the platform's base, and Thomas could feel hundreds of eyes on them, could hear the murmur of the crowd like distant thunder. Reverend Talbot stood on the platform in his ceremonial robes, a Bible open in his hands, his expression carefully neutral. Behind him, 3 county officials had gathered, the clerk, the sheriff, and the magistrate. Not as participants, but as witnesses to whatever was about to unfold. Their presence gave the event an official weight that transcended mere spectacle. Abraham led the group up the platform steps, positioning them with the same attention he'd give to arranging furniture. Thomas stood in the center with Sarah on his right, Rebecca and Mary to his left. The children, 2-year-old Samuel and 6-month-old Grace, were held by Peter, who stood at the platform's far edge, visible but separate. Abraham took his own position slightly behind and to the side, a patriarch overseeing his family's strange ritual. The crowd pressed closer, perhaps 400 people packed into the square. Thomas recognized neighboring planters and their families, town merchants, craftsmen, and in the back, beyond the white spectators, a large group of enslaved people who'd been given permission to witness the ceremony. Their presence was crucial to Abraham's plan. This needed to be seen by everyone, needed to become a story that would be told and retold in precisely the way Abraham controlled. Reverend Talbot cleared his throat, and the crowd's murmur faded to expectant silence. "We are gathered here," he began, his voice carrying across the square, "in the sight of God and this community to witness an unusual covenant. Thomas Sutherland has come before us to declare his commitment to these 3 women, to acknowledge them before heaven and earth." The Reverend was walking a careful line, using the language of marriage without explicitly calling it that, invoking spiritual authority while avoiding legal specifics. He continued with a brief sermon about responsibility, about the duties men owe to those under their protection, about Christ's teachings regarding the least among us. It was theologically sound enough to provide cover while remaining vague enough to mean almost anything. Then came the vows themselves, and here the ceremony veered into territory that made even the most sympathetic spectators uncomfortable. "Thomas Sutherland," Talbot intoned, "do you take Sarah as your wife? To care for her in sickness and health, to provide for her wants, to acknowledge before God and community your bond with her?" Thomas's voice cracked slightly. "I do." "Do you take Rebecca as your wife? To care for her in sickness and health? To provide for her wants? To acknowledge before God and community your bond with her?" "I do." "Do you take Mary as your wife? To care for her in sickness and health? To provide for her wants? To acknowledge before God and community your bond with her?" "I do." The Reverend turned to each woman in sequence, asking if they accepted Thomas as their husband, if they entered this covenant willingly. Each answered yes, their voices steady despite the hundreds of staring eyes. Sarah's yes carried defiance. Rebecca's carried resignation. Mary's carried something that might have been hope. When the vows were complete, Talbot closed his Bible and raised his hands. "Before God and this community, I declare these bonds acknowledged. May the Lord have mercy on all involved." It wasn't "you may kiss the bride." It wasn't "I now pronounce you man and wife." The language was deliberately ambiguous, recognizing something without quite naming it. And yet, legally void though they were, those vows had been witnessed by 400 people. They existed now as social fact, undeniable and permanent. Abraham stepped forward with 4 documents he'd had prepared, marriage certificates drafted by a lawyer from Richmond, carefully worded to acknowledge the ceremony without claiming legal status. The county clerk had been instructed to sign as witness, creating a paper trail that existed in official records without constituting actual marriage licenses. It was a bureaucratic magic trick, giving the appearance of legitimacy while remaining legally void. As the clerk signed each document, a voice rang out from the crowd. "This is an abomination." Heads turned. The speaker was Harrison Caldwell, owner of an adjacent plantation and one of Abraham's longtime business rivals. Caldwell pushed through the crowd toward the platform, his face flushed with rage. "You've made a mockery of marriage, Sutherland. These creatures are property, not wives. You degraded your family name, degraded all of us by forcing us to witness this travesty." Abraham had been expecting opposition, but Caldwell's timing was unfortunate. Before Abraham could respond, another voice joined the argument, this one from Joseph Brennan, a younger planter known for his religious fervor. "Actually," Brennan called out, his voice carrying unexpected authority, "what we've witnessed is a man taking responsibility. How many here can say their sons haven't taken advantage of enslaved women? At least Thomas Sutherland stands before us honestly." The crowd erupted into argument. Some men shouted agreement with Caldwell, calling the ceremony a disgrace. Others, perhaps uncomfortable with the implications for their own households, defended Abraham's approach as practical. Women in the crowd whispered urgently to each other, their faces reflecting a complex mix of scandal, sympathy, and vicarious horror. On the platform, Thomas felt Sarah's hand grip his arm. He looked at her and saw tears streaming down her face, not from fear or shame, but from something else entirely. Later, she would tell him that in that moment, listening to white men argue about her humanity, she felt herself become real in a way she never had before. The ceremony might be legally void, but it had forced everyone present to confront the cognitive dissonance at the heart of their society. Abraham raised his hands, calling for silence. When the crowd finally quieted, he spoke with the commanding presence of a man used to being obeyed. "What happens in my family is my concern," he said firmly. "I've brought you here because I believe in transparency, in handling difficult matters before the community. Thomas has made choices I don't approve of, but he's standing here taking responsibility like a man. That's more than can be said for many young people these days. This ceremony is done. The marriages are acknowledged. Now we all return to our affairs." It was a dismissal, clear and final. Slowly, the crowd began to disperse, though knots of people remained to argue, to speculate, to process what they'd witnessed. Thomas helped the women down from the platform, acutely aware that everything had changed, and nothing had changed. They were married in the eyes of 400 witnesses, but still enslaved in the eyes of the law. The return to Hollow Crest should have been a relief, but instead it marked the beginning of a different kind of nightmare. Abraham's grand gesture had indeed controlled the immediate narrative, but it had also created a set of consequences he hadn't fully anticipated. The first problem emerged within days. Abraham had intended the public marriage to establish boundaries, to make clear that Thomas's relationships were now proper and therefore contained. But several neighboring planters saw it differently. If enslaved women could be publicly married to their owner's son, what did that mean for the status of any enslaved person? The ceremony had inadvertently suggested that enslaved people could enter contracts, could make choices that carried social weight, could exist as parties to agreements rather than as mere property. A delegation arrived at Hollow Crest on Tuesday, led by Harrison Caldwell and 2 other major landowners. They met with Abraham in his study, and their message was blunt: the ceremony had been a mistake that was causing unrest on their own plantations. Enslaved people were asking questions, wondering if they too could have their relationships recognized, if their families might be protected from separation. The social order required clear boundaries, and Abraham had blurred them dangerously. Abraham tried to explain his reasoning, but Caldwell cut him off. "You've opened a door, Sutherland, and now every one of us will have to deal with what walks through it." The meeting ended with barely concealed hostility, and Abraham realized his calculation had been flawed. He'd solved one problem while creating several others. Meanwhile, in the main house, Sarah, Rebecca, and Mary were discovering the reality of their new status. Abraham had moved them into the guest wing permanently, insisted they take meals with the family, and forbidden them from performing manual labor. On the surface, this seemed like elevation, but it was really isolation. The other enslaved people at Hollow Crest didn't know how to treat them. They were still slaves, but they'd been married to the master's son in front of the entire county. Were they to be respected? Resented? The resulting tension poisoned the atmosphere. Worse, white society had effectively shunned them. Women who might have visited Hollow Crest to pay social calls now avoided it. Thomas and his 3 wives existed in a social void, acknowledged, but not accepted, visible, but not seen. Thomas spent his days trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy, teaching Sarah, Rebecca, and Mary more advanced reading, discussing with them his still vague plans for escape to the north. But the plans felt increasingly hopeless. They had no money. Abraham controlled all finances tightly. They had no connections outside Virginia. And now, after the public ceremony, they were under constant observation. Abraham had assigned Peter to essentially guard them, ostensibly for their protection, but really to prevent any attempt at running. Then, in early August, something happened that would crack open the careful stability Abraham had tried to impose. Mary went into labor 3 weeks early, her body racked with complications from the stress of the previous weeks. The birth was difficult, attended by an enslaved midwife named Ruth, who had delivered dozens of babies at Hollow Crest. For 12 hours, Mary struggled while Thomas paced outside the room, listening to her screams and feeling utterly powerless. Sarah and Rebecca stayed with her, holding her hands, whispering encouragement. The child, a girl Mary named Elizabeth, survived. But Mary didn't. She died an hour after the birth, her body simply giving out after too much trauma, too much strain. Ruth said later it was exhaustion as much as any physical complication, that Mary's spirit had been fighting battles her body couldn't sustain. Thomas held Mary's cooling hand and wept like a child while Abraham stood in the doorway, his face unreadable. The death changed something fundamental. This wasn't abstract anymore, wasn't about property or social standing or family legacy. A 20-year-old woman had died, leaving behind a newborn daughter, and she died because Thomas had loved her, and Abraham had made them all perform in a public spectacle. The funeral was small, held in the enslaved people's cemetery at the edge of Hollow Crest's property. Reverend Talbot came at Thomas's insistence, though Abraham opposed it. The minister said brief words over Mary's grave, and Thomas stood between Sarah and Rebecca, holding baby Elizabeth, understanding for the first time the full weight of what his fantasy of love and family had cost. That night, Thomas went to his father's study. He didn't knock, just walked in and found Abraham sitting at his desk, reviewing accounts as though nothing had happened. "This is your fault," Thomas said, his voice low and controlled. "Your ceremony killed her." Abraham looked up, his expression tired. "The ceremony didn't kill her. Childbirth killed her. It happens. It's tragic, but it happens. You paraded her like an animal. You forced her to stand in front of hundreds of people while pregnant, made her an object of mockery. I made her visible." Abraham's voice rose suddenly. "Before that ceremony, she was nothing. No one. At least I gave her recognition, gave her child a father who acknowledges her. Don't you dare blame me for trying to salvage your disaster." They stared at each other across the desk, and Thomas saw clearly that his father would never understand, could never see these women as fully human. The ceremony, for all its apparent acknowledgement, had been just another form of ownership, another way of controlling property. "I'm leaving," Thomas said quietly. "I'm taking Sarah, Rebecca, and the children, and we're going north." Abraham's laugh was bitter. "With what money? What plan? You can't even get to Richmond without being stopped." "They're my property, Thomas. Legally mine. Try to take them, and I'll have the sheriff bring them back before you reach the county line." It was true, and Thomas knew it. The marriage certificates Abraham had created were meaningless outside the specific context of that ceremony. They didn't grant freedom, didn't change legal ownership, didn't provide any protection at all. They were theatre, nothing more. Thomas left the study without another word and returned to the room he now shared with Sarah and Rebecca. He found them sitting together, Rebecca nursing Elizabeth while Sarah held young Samuel. They looked up at him with eyes that held no illusions about their situation. "We're trapped," Sarah said softly. It wasn't a question. Thomas nodded. "But I'll find a way. I promise I'll find a way." What came next unfolded over several months, a slow escalation that would ultimately force a confrontation none of them anticipated. In September, Abraham received a letter from a cotton planter in Alabama, a man named Charles Weatherby, who'd heard about the Chesterfield ceremony through the network of correspondence that connected slaveholders across the South. Weatherby's letter was polite but pointed. He was interested in purchasing Rebecca and her daughter Grace, along with Sarah and Samuel if they could be induced to come as well. He'd pay above market value, understanding that the situation at Hollow Crest was delicate. Abraham didn't tell Thomas about the letter immediately. Instead, he considered the offer seriously. The ceremony had achieved its goal of preventing immediate scandal, but it had left him with an ongoing problem. As long as Sarah and Rebecca remained at Hollow Crest, they would be sources of tension, reminders of his family's irregular arrangement. Selling them would resolve that, would restore a kind of normalcy, and Weatherby's offer was genuinely generous. When Abraham finally showed Thomas the letter in late September, the confrontation was explosive. Thomas threatened to expose everything, to go public with the exact nature of the ceremony, to destroy what remained of Abraham's reputation. Abraham responded by threatening to separate the children from their mothers, to sell each to different buyers so Thomas could never find them all again. The standoff revealed the fundamental truth of their situation. Abraham held all the actual power, and Thomas had nothing but emotional leverage that could be crushed at any moment. Sarah, overhearing the argument from the hallway, made a decision. That night, she met secretly with Peter, the man Abraham had assigned to watch them. Peter had grown up at Hollow Crest, had known Thomas since they were boys, and the ceremony had affected him in ways he hadn't expected. Watching Sarah, Rebecca, and Mary stand on that platform had made him think differently about his own family, about the woman he lived with and their children who could be sold away at any time. "Will you help us run?" Sarah asked him directly. Peter considered this for a long time. "Where would you go?" "Ohio. Thomas has a cousin in Cincinnati who's sympathetic to." She hesitated, using the careful language necessary for such conversations, to people seeking their freedom. "If we can reach him, he might help us get to Canada. Mr. Abraham will come after you. He'll spend whatever it takes." "I know. But we have to try." Peter nodded slowly. "I'll help. But we need resources. Money, travel papers, connections. We can't just run blind into the night." What followed was a conspiracy more intricate than anything Thomas could have conceived alone. Peter reached out to a network he'd quietly maintained for years, enslaved people and free blacks who helped runaway slaves move north. Sarah began stealing small amounts of cash from household accounts, taking only amounts small enough not to be immediately noticed. Rebecca made contact with a Quaker merchant in Richmond who was known to sympathize with abolitionists, trading sewing work for information about safe routes and sympathetic contacts. Through October and November, they planned while maintaining the appearance of compliance. Thomas played his part by pretending to accept his father's authority, by appearing defeated and resigned. Abraham, believing he'd won, relaxed his vigilance slightly. The planning required extraordinary caution. Every conversation had to appear casual, every meeting coincidental. Sarah developed a system of leaving notes hidden in the main house's library, tucked between pages of books she knew Thomas would consult. Rebecca used her trips to the smokehouse as opportunities to meet with Peter, who would update her on progress with the underground contacts. They communicated in fragments, in half-sentences, always aware that discovery would mean not just the end of their escape plans, but likely their sale to the Deep South as punishment. Thomas, meanwhile, had to maintain his facade of resignation while secretly gathering what resources he could. He sold his watch, a graduation gift from his mother, to a merchant in town, claiming he needed cash for a private matter. He liquidated a small trust his maternal grandfather had left him, money Abraham didn't control, withdrawing it in increments small enough not to raise alarm. Every dollar went into a leather pouch Sarah kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard in their room. The real breakthrough came from an unexpected source. In early December, Joseph Brennan, the younger planter who defended the ceremony back in July, approached Thomas privately after a church service. Brennan's own conscience had been troubled by what he'd witnessed, and he'd been corresponding with Northern abolitionists about the moral implications of slavery. He offered Thomas something precious, forged travel papers identifying Sarah and Rebecca as free women of color, along with $200 in cash. "I can't make this right," Brennan told Thomas, his voice low and urgent. They stood behind the church, ostensibly discussing crop prices while conducting a transaction that could get them both imprisoned. "But I can make it possible. These papers are good. Made by a man in Philadelphia who knows his craft. They'll pass inspection unless you're terribly unlucky." Thomas took the documents with trembling hands, understanding that Brennan was risking everything by helping them. "Why are you doing this?" Brennan's expression was pained. "Because I stood on that platform in July and told myself your father was doing something honorable. But I've spent these months thinking about what I really witnessed, a man trying to turn human beings into a solution to his social embarrassment. I can't undo my part in it, but I can help you undo his." The forged papers were remarkable in their attention to detail. They identified Sarah as Sarah Freeman, free woman of color, born in Richmond, Virginia, 1822, and Rebecca as Rebecca Williams, free woman of color, born in Petersburg, Virginia, 1825. Each document included a physical description, a notarized statement of manumission dated several years earlier, and travel permits allowing them to move freely through Virginia and beyond. The forgeries wouldn't withstand deep scrutiny, but for casual inspection by a sheriff or a railroad conductor, they would likely suffice. With Brennan's help, the escape plan crystallized. They would leave during the Christmas season, when travel was common and less suspicious. Peter knew a steamboat captain who could take them to Richmond for a price, and from Richmond they could take trains north, using the forged papers to pass as a white man traveling with his